Hi, and welcome to our latest podcast brought to you by the Network for Financial Crime Prevention, or NFCP. I am the host and the founder of NFCP, Louis Vargas. And in this episode, we have the privilege to have Jan Lepeu, hopefully I pronounced it correctly, a PhD researcher and lecturer who recently successfully defended his paper. So I thought it would be really cool to talk to him today, learn more about him, learn more how he became interested in sanctions, because some people are attracted to it from an academic angle and that's how they get into it, and some just fall into it accidentally like I did. So it'd be really good to hear from Jan on these topics. But before we get started, I wanted to quickly point out that all the views that we will express today and opinions that we have, do not reflect our it's only our personal views, so please use this for informational purposes only and not for legal advice. If you have specific questions, please reach out to your local compliance team or legal team. And also, I humbly request all those of you who are watching and listening, if you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, please reach out to us via our LinkedIn channels. If you have any questions after this specific piece, please feel free to reach out to us and we could share with Jan, or you could reach out to him as well. So with all that out of the way, Jan, I was just hoping if you could give a quick introduction to yourself, to our community, and then we'll start the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. So I'm a researcher, an academic researcher on the topic of sanctions, and I'm also like a lecturer. And the first thing to say, I think, to a compliance audience is that I've been not trained in law. I've been trained in political science and international relations. And I mainly focus my research on sanctions and EU foreign policy, and I teach around those topics as well. So that's basically it. And as you kindly mentioned, I also just finished my PhD dissertation that I defended like 2 weeks ago now, which was actually focusing on the history and emergence of EU sanctions.
Awesome. Thanks again, Jan, for being with us today. And yeah, let's just dive in. So, you've had a fantastic academic and professional journey from LSE to the College of Europe, and now a PhD researcher at the EUI. So I'm just curious, what initially drew you to this field of international sanctions and EU foreign policy?
I also stumbled upon it a little bit by luck. So I basically, so I was studying international relations, and at one point I realized I probably needed to specialize myself a bit more. And I'm not very good at learning languages. So if I was like very good at languages, I would probably have tried to become like an Iran like expert and learn Farsi. But I quickly realized that would probably be too much for me to chew. And so I focused on the foreign policy of the European Union because I was in Europe and I was very interested by the European Union. And when I was doing that, I wrote my first master work on the foreign policy of the European Union. And I quickly realized that like a very important part of what the European Union foreign policy is actually sanctions. And so then, as you mentioned, I did a second degree at the College of Europe. And then I had the opportunity to write the first master dissertation on EU sanctions. And since then, I found the topic like utterly fascinating. And I think the reason why I find it so fascinating is that on one side, sanctions have a very technical aspects that all the compliance officers in the audience will recognize, but there is also like a very kind of high political or high politics like aspect to it. And I really like this kind of mixture of like very technical questions and being able to acquire like a very specific knowledge, but also this ability to tackle like very big questions about international order, international politics, geopolitics through the prisms of sanctions. So that's how I kind of ended up like sticking to the topic and writing my dissertation research on.
Thank you for that. And a lot of people don't know that the first recorded, I guess, sanctions happened in ancient Greece. I mean, I guess it would have to be Europe, right? Because nobody has records of ancient Americas, or maybe not that far back in China or in the Asian region. But a lot of people, when I mentioned that to them, that it happened in nation states in the Greek, they're like, really? We thought this was an American construct. And it's like, no, 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 no. This predates the United States. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely super interesting. I agree with you to learn more about sanctions and how it's used and how it intertwines with geopolitics and now even the military industrial complex, right? So Yeah, it's interesting to hear you call out a lot of those similarities that even I have had, what drew me into it. And for me, my degree is in social science and history. So even further away than you, I would say you were kind of still very close to the topic. But I think, living through 9/11, I was living in New York at the time. And also I was in Barcelona, 2017 when the attacks happened there. So I felt like being in this field was kind of, okay, this is my way of giving back and kind of, trying to be on the forefront of what's happening in a way that I can support. But it's also, when you see how sanctions are applied, I feel like it's an internal struggle I have, because in one way you could see kind of the political and geopolitical implications, but then you see how it's also hurting innocent people in those areas. Sometimes I struggle with those two. But yeah, enough about my personal point on that. Yeah, so let's just go deeper into kind of your insights into that. So based on your experiences working in humanitarian and trade sectors, how did it shape your perception on sanctions and the real world impact?
I think it's kind of linked to something you just mentioned, which is the humanitarian impact of sanctions. So like I was born and raised in Geneva, which is obviously like a city in Switzerland, a city with a lot of international organizations, but also like humanitarian organizations. And when you worked on sanctions here, like the main kind of topic of sanctions is how they sometimes impeach or prevent the work of like humanitarian organizations, their ability to bring materials and funds to like people's in need and so on and so on. So you right away like understand, I would say, the seriousness of sanctions. I think there is sometimes a misconception of sanctions that like some people think it's a bit of a weak instrument, or it's not something that we should care too much about. But I actually think that often the impact of sanctions is very dramatic, and it can be actually far worse than some military operations, because there is no Geneva Convention for sanctions. Sanctions kind of touch often the civilian population as much as the persons you try to target. And so there is, I think, this element of sanctions that we should always keep in mind. And I mean, the politics around sanctions and certain case of sanctions are very complex. But I think the one thing that people should always keep in mind is that actually there are like quite a serious instruments with quite dramatic effects. And regardless of the good or bad causes you use them for, and that's always like a constant.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in the beginning, I was like, yeah, if that country is not doing the right thing, then, they deserve it. But then, like you said, the innocent people that had no choice in the decisions the government made, they're the innocent victims of this. And I feel like we're driving toward more of smart sanctions, as they're referred to, where they are a bit more direct and targeted, but it still impacts, I feel like, innocent people way more than it does the people they're intending it to kind of target. But we're moving, I feel like, in a better direction than what we've seen in the past, where it was just simply countrywide sanctions. So we'll see how.
I think 5 years ago, it would have been very easy to say that we move to a world of more targeted sanctions, of smarter sanctions. I'm not completely sure it's still the case today. I think we have seen like quite a few sanctions like regimes that kind of like move back a little bit more towards the more comprehensive type of sanctions. They're still smart in theory, in the sense that they're still kind of like individually like quite targeted instruments. But if you look at the overall effect that like all those instruments like put together and all those listings put together have, we start to have like kind of economic effects that are not that far from like the comprehensive embargoes of the early 90s, for example. So I think that actually there is a trend of like, I've called it like detargetization in one paper I published recently, which is something I think that was already in motion like in the US, but I think now in the EU there is also, especially in the latest rounds of sanctions against Russia, a return to kind of like more comprehensive forms of sanction.
That's a great point. And if that paper is published on the internet, hopefully we could share the link afterwards. No, that is a good point. And maybe it's where, we're trying to be a bit more targeted on the outset, but then when it's not working, then we say, screw that. We're gonna just go comprehensive, or maybe don't make it seem like that in the outset. But like you said, the way that things are targeted, it's kind of comprehensive anyway. But that's a good point. Yeah, I guess I didn't think of it that way, but that makes perfect sense. Yeah, so next question. Your doctoral thesis focuses on international sanctions, as we discussed already and shared. Could you share maybe a key insight or surprising find from your research that challenged your initial assumptions?
So the core of my research is really revolves around the question of like how like sanctions became such a prominent tools of EU foreign policy. And I think maybe the most surprising insights for me, but also for others, is to look back in time and to see how like what we think of sanctions now was not the case at the time. So now I think there is what I call like a normalization of sanctions. So as European policymakers, I think there is often like this idea that like sanctions is what the European Union does. It's part of what the European Union is and wants to do in the world. It's kind of linked to this idea that the European Union is the defender of international norms, international law, and so on and so on. But actually, my research starts like in the 80s, in the first moments where like the European collectively like adopted sanctions together. And at the time, you can now access the archives. I could access like the conversations between like policymakers and diplomats of the European countries at the time. And what you see is at the time, like they had a very negative conceptions of sanctions. So they thought sanctions was actually like quite ineffective, that there was a lot of cost, both like humanitarian, but also diplomatic and economic cost to that. And so they had like overall like a quite negative outlet on what sanctions are and can do. And that basically changed quite radically like over the decades after that. And I think that's quite interesting to think that like now there is this sensation that sanctions as a very normal tool of EU foreign policy, but that was not always the case. And the arguments now that like sanctions are inherent to the European Union because it's linked to what the European Union is and stands for the world. But you almost had the reverse argument at the time. So at the time, the argument was European Union is all about like economic interdependence. It's all about kind of like peace through trade and so on and so on. And therefore, sanctions seems a little bit like antagonistic to like some of the core values of the European integration project. And so basically, I think it's quite interesting to see that what now seems like a very natural state of affairs was not always the case. And there is like a specific history on how we arrived to what we see today.
And I guess this leads perfectly into our next question is the EU of these had a very different view of sanctions than we do today. And how do you think that's transformed the nature of the EU itself? Or has it?
Yeah, I think it has actually. In my thesis, I try to make the argument that it has, and I think there is two maybe moments to look at how it transformed the EU. So the first one is to go back to the 80s. Actually, the European Union didn't exist in the 80s. The core of the European integration was something called the European Economic Community that was dealing with like the economic governance of the European kind of like member states, but also very importantly, it was also that the one that kind of was dealing with the common trade policy of all those member states. Foreign policy was kept completely separately because the states at the time were very kind of worried that Brussels would kind of get involved in foreign policy. So they set up something completely different, which was called the European Political Cooperation, which was very informal, where like the European Commission and Parliament and so on were not at all involved. And the idea was to have like those two different like spheres where two different type of like political questions were answered. What sanctions brought is basically like the need to do like a hybridization of those two spheres, because obviously sanctions is the use of economic means for political gains. And so you have like the gains which are about foreign policy, but the means that are about trade policy. And so we needed to have like some more interconnection between those two spheres of power. And that basically is part of the history of how like the Treaty of Maastricht and the European Union were created, with the kind of idea of having this common foreign and security policy inside the European Union, and to basically bring the foreign policy making and the economic policy making like together under the single pillar, like the single heart of the European Union.
Yeah, excuse my ignorance because I'm from the US. So thank you for sharing that information. It totally makes sense how those two kind of worlds collided where, like you said, originally they're trying to keep it separate because they don't want to give up too much of their sovereignty, right? Because that's pretty much, when you're making these agreements, you're kind of giving away a bit of your power. They wanted to stay as strong as they felt they needed to be. But to provide more of a cohesive front, you would need to, tear down some of those walls to have some of that cohesion. And now we're seeing even today, kind of pan-European organizations like AMLA that's now coming into form, where in the past, I think that would have been not even ever considered because they don't want no central European body telling any member state what to do, right? They want their own ability to accept or decide what's best for them. So I think that's another way we're kind of seeing a relaxing of that original thought of we're keeping everything separate. We'll have these conversations and try to align where we can, but we'll keep our own kind of decisions to ourselves. And now you're seeing more of a gelling of that.
Yeah, and actually, I think now it's another very interesting time to ask this question on how sanctions change the European Union, because I would actually argue that like the effect of the sanctions against Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has also been to change a little bit the rules of how like policies are made in the European Union. So for you listeners, like sanctions are usually at the European Union are like taken legally by the Council, which is basically the body of the European Union where all the member states sit. And so it's really the member states that adopt the sanctions. And historically, it's those member states that also prepare the sanctions with the help of something called the European Union External Service, which is basically the kind of the Foreign Affairs Department of the European Union. But it's really like in the hands of the member states, and they are the one decide who are like listed and so on and so on. And most of the negotiation happens between those member states. What happens in the sanctions taken against Russia since February 2022 is that like it's the European Commission that has been in driving seat. And the reason for that is what we referred to the detargetization of sanctions before. It's because the sanctions taken against Russia since 2022 are much more about sectoral sanctions, which like kind of impact directly like large parts of the EU policies. So like the EU transport policies, the EU trade policies, the EU media policies, and so on and so on. And therefore, the kind of technical expertise, but not necessarily in the member states' diplomats, but was in different parts of the European Commission. And the output of all of that is that basically we saw that the European Commission, which normally, according to the EU treaties, should not be in the driving seats for foreign policy, became on the driving seat. And a bit like in the 80s, we have still this connection between basically the tension between like an instrument that's all about kind of like economic governance, that historically is where the European Commission like plays a major role, and foreign policy goals. And so I think there is now, it's a bit early to say if it's going to change like how the European Union functions like forever. But we have like this tendency of seeing the European Commission and the president of the European Commission in particular having a much like kind of stronger hand in the foreign policy making of the European Union.
Right. It's funny you mentioned that because, you know, I think you're right. This whole, the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine has given different powers or different abilities for different units or agencies within the Union and around the world. You know, people say you thank Putin and thank Trump for bringing Europe together, right? Because one was the war and then one was the US kind of turning its back to its partners and is strengthening Europe in a way that they feel they have to, you know, come together to protect each other, but also be more self-sufficient. And I'm just curious, you know, I know that we kind of didn't talk about this in the past, but I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think that the war in the Ukraine and kind of the US's almost isolation approach, do you think that has strengthened Europe, or do you think that it's maybe looking the other way and weakening Europe?
I think in many ways it's a bit too early to tell. I think there is dynamics that clearly kind of push like Europeans together and maybe to like a more centralized form of like policy making in Europe, but also other dynamics that kind of push certain European states in other directions. And because they have a veto power on sanctions making, but on foreign policy making in general, it might also like kind of weaken the European Union. So I think there's those kind of different dynamics like playing out. I mean, time will tell like which one like, prevails. But I think for sanctions, for sure, there is a move to kind of more centralization, more Europeanization. How exactly it's going to play out, I think it's also a bit too early to tell. But I think it was really a wake-up call for the Europeans to be serious, not only about taking sanctions, but also about implementing the sanctions they are taking. And I think here the question of the US actually may be the most important, because for a long time, the EU was kind of sanctioning alongside the US. And therefore, if like most of the implementation of the sanctions were done by the OFAC and the Treasury Department in the US, that would kind of like be enough to kind of not only kind of like make sure private actors kind of follow the US sanctions, but also follow the EU sanctions that were like very similar in substance. We are now in a moment where we see that the European Union is still ready to take sanctions against Russia, where like for now, it's not the case in the US. And so like the big question is like, if you have a divergence of the sanctions regimes, how does that going to play out in terms of implementation? Because suddenly the EU itself has to be the actor that's able to kind of scare like private actors enough to get them to implement their sanctions.
Yeah, and I think the big difference between EU and the US has been enforcement. So I think you're hitting the nail on the head, right? So that OFAC and the Treasury Department are not afraid to enforce sanctions, and they do it quite regularly. Not so much in this administration so far, but they've never been afraid to. Where the EU, I don't want to say is reluctance, but I think it's also maybe they haven't. Yeah, not sure quite how to implement it, I guess the way I'll put it, how they would appropriately implement enforcement. We're seeing also the UK now after Brexit being a bit more vocal with their enforcement actions, even though they're kind of small in monetary numbers, but still the act itself, I think it's waking people up to the fact that the UK means business. I mean, they've also stated after Brexit they want to emulate what OFAC has done. So we'll we'll see what happens there, but we'll see what the member states do as far as being stronger on the enforcement front, or even what AMLA brings to the table, right? Because a lot of this is thought to reside with them, but again, it's very unclear what that would look like. But I think you're right. I think we'll see most of the change when enforcement becomes a bigger threat in the EU. I'm just curious, do you think that the trigger would be more enforcement actions, or you think there's something else behind it?
No, I think you're completely right. And I think what's interesting in the case of the UK actually was an argument after Brexit to say that we can sanctions by ourselves now. We don't have to wait for 27 or 28 at the time, like member states to agree on the sanctions. So
Right.
actually sanctions were like one of the arguments put forward to say, oh, we have more freedom and kind of rapidity of action because of Brexit, which is one of the reasons why they move so fast in kind of like developing their own sanctions program. But at the European level, I think it's still like it's clearly a discussion that's ongoing. I think there is a lot of like ideas movement. It's a bit hard for now to know where the ball is going to land exactly, but it's clearly like something that's ongoing. And I mean, at the core of the problem is that the European Union is not a state. So it's not the United States, it's not the UK.
Right.
So like implementation is a bit more different. And in the EU sanctions, the way it's set up for now is that the implementation is done by the member states. So the EU is the sanctions are taken at the European level, but implementation is done by the member states. And that raises a lot of questions about like enforcement and harmonization of enforcements across member states. But there's also like other questions that are very like, I think, crucial here. So we think on the one side of the need for centralization for enforcement, but the other need of centralization is to give license and kind of clear answers to private actors that want to know, can I trade with this guy? Can I trade with this country? If those actors need to go to like 6 or 7 different EU member states to have an answer to that, and that they sometimes given different answers, that becomes like a massive problem. So we need to be sure that while maybe enforcement needs to be stronger, we at the same time have also like getting better at giving like kind of like clear directives to private actors in the EU, because otherwise the risk is that we're going to reproduce like the discussion that was like in the early 20s in the US, which is that the European firms are going to say to the EU, it's really like we are struggling because all the other companies from other countries don't have the same issues. And even countries like the US or the UK that also have sanctions have a clear interlocutor they can ask the question to and know exactly where is the red line. At the European Union, also, we will need at one point to have more in that direction.
That's a great point. And just to piggyback on it, interpretation, right? Because, you have lawyers sitting across Europe, they could read these regulations and laws and interpret it in different ways. So, then the implementation that affects, the implementation of it. So yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. We have to figure out how, once we agree to what the sanction should be, there has to also be an agreement on what should be the interpretation of it. So there's a baseline across the union and not this fragmented approach that we see today. And also that point of, asking, well, knowing who to ask, but then even when you get to the correct competent authority, sometimes they don't know how to answer the question. They know that they should receive the question. They won't argue that, but they'll just say, they'll throw up their hands because they don't know. They have never faced these questions before, nor they were part of these discussions. So even for them, they might not even have the capacity to answer all these questions, right? Because they have very small teams. So yeah, I think a lot of that plays into it. So yeah.
No, and what you see ongoing is basically, I mean, there is this question about how to restructure that kind of sanctioning system at the European level, but you also see like restructuration at the national level. And because you said national authorities, like in many countries, depending on which aspect of sanctions you want an answer to, you need to talk to different people.
Exactly.
And so like just to know, like, so like the travels ban might be one national authority, the asset freeze might be another one, and so on and so on. So I think actually we see now, and that's a bit more rapid maybe in the making, that a lot of European countries are changing a little bit, sometimes the legislation, but often just the organization of like the state, and the different parts of the states are in charge of different questions around sanctions. And I think that should already like make it a bit easier. And then there's another like organic process like ongoing right now, which is that the more sanctions questions are being asked, the more we have like a jurisprudence from the Court of Justice of the European Union on those sanctions questions. And that gives us a little bit more certainty in terms of like kind of this question of how to kind of interpret different like sanctions questions. But that obviously takes a long time, and it's not exactly the same as kind of being able to ask to a single entity, like, is it okay to do that or is it not okay to do that?
Right. So true. And, you know, we're talking about kind of the implementation of it. And that leads nicely into the next question is, you know, what are some of the most effective or ineffective sanctions regimes that you've seen implemented by the EU in recent years, and why?
So here I'm going to have to give you a very academic answer, which is like, it's very complicated. So I think the first thing is like effectiveness is a very unclear term. So economists talk about effectiveness in terms of like, how does it affect the economy of the targeted state? So that's one thing, but you might have states where like the economy is like heavily affected without any political change whatsoever. Like I'm thinking of North Korea, for example. So those sanctions are like, or used to be at least, like very effective in economic terms, but in political terms, not at all. Right. And then when you talk about political effectiveness, usually we think about like inducing a change of policy in the targeted regime. And so that's what we call like coercion. But that might not be the kind of the main goal. So if we think about the most important sanctions regime right now, like the sanctions taken against Russia, I mean, it's a bit complicated to know exactly what policymakers wanted to do. Like at one point, I tried to compile like all the kind of the comments and so on from different politicians and bureaucrats across the EU, and it was going in every direction. But I think what's clear now is, at least for the Ukrainians, what's the most important is the impact it has on the war economy and the war machine in Russia. And so that's not about kind of changing the policy of Russia. It's just about making sure that they kind of build less missiles and shells and tanks that they would otherwise. But to calculate if that's effective or not, it's even more complicated and kind of raise a lot of kind of methodological question. So I would say in general, it's a very complicated. In general, like I think in the past, the kind of the flagship case of like effective sanctions used to be Iran. So the sanctions taken for the nuclear program of Iran, which led to the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. But that obviously didn't last very long, because then Trump was elected, exited the JCPOA, and we were back to square one. So, but that used to be like when you would open like any kind of books about sanctions, like the kind of the example of like very effective sanctions. Maybe some sanctions that have like maybe not very effective, at least like created a lot of stuff that we're not supposed to create, is I always give the example of the sanctions taken against China in March 2021 by the European Union. So the European Union had adopted like this kind of horizontal human rights sanctions regime on which it could list people for human rights abuses across any country. So it was not like a regime that was targeted against a specific country. And they listed like 3 or 4, I don't remember exactly the number, regional Chinese officials from the certain like province where there was the Uyghur like kind of like atrocity ongoing. That was supposed to be like kind of mainly like a low-key event, just to show that the European Union was happy to sanction anybody and not just like kind of weak African states, and so on and so on. But what happened after that is that China took counter sanctions. So they sanctioned like some European, including some member of the European Parliament. And because of that, there was this kind of this agreement, this investment agreement, has been kind of negotiated for more than almost 10 years. That's been completely blocked because it needed to be voted by the European Parliament, which was now sanctioned by China. In many ways, like those sanctions created a lot, so that may be a way in which they're effective. They changed like the relationship between China and the EU quite considerably. But at the same time, that was never like the intended purpose of the sanctions in the first place.
Interesting. And, you know, talking about unintended consequences, you know, leads into the next question on how, you know, I guess, how can policymakers be better at designing sanctions that are both effective and ethically sound? I can't even speak. Yeah.
So I think it's probably quite a difficult task, and I would sometimes think that it's not always what they have in mind. But I would think that the best advice is to say that clarity is key, because something we know about sanctions is that like there is what we call the de-risking effect, is that you have a lot of private sector companies that in doubt will not touch this country or will not touch a certain sector of the country because they don't want to pay like thousands and thousands of dollars or euros like in kind of lawyers' fees to understand what exactly they can do and not do. Right. And they know that even if they do that, there is always a risk that it's gonna like turn against them. So they just say we're not gonna touch it. And the more like kind of unclear the sanctions regimes are, the more you have this de-risking phenomenon where like most companies, especially the one that don't have like kind of in-house like kind of compliance officers, will say like, okay, that's too complicated for us. We will go to another market and not to this market. And that's one of the main reasons why like sanctions create those kind of humanitarian kind of effects. It's because like basically it's not necessarily that the sanctions themselves, like most sanctions regime before and more recently even more, like always have like provisions saying that like basic goods are allowed, that kind of it shouldn't like impeach like humanitarian access and so on and so on. But in practice, actually, it gets very complicated. I've talked to kind of people working in NGOs saying we cannot buy like oil at the petrol station in Syria because it's owned by the government and the government sanctions and so on and so on. So it kind of creates all those effects, and the more kind of unclarity you have, the bigger the risk. But at the same time, and I think that's especially true in the US, this kind of lack of clarity is almost by design because they know that this lack of clarity make the sanctions more effective in economic terms, that they kind of like push the economic pain like spectrum like much higher. And so I would also like know that that's kind of a complicated question. And then maybe to focus a little bit on what the Europeans could do better, it's like also this question of licensing. So we said the US is kind of very unclear. So I think that's like sometimes a bad point for US sanctions, but they have maybe a better like system of like licensing where they can sometimes give general license and they can kind of give clear answer to clear kind of actors saying, oh, you're allowed to do that. And we kind of are going to give you like the green light. And I think that's something we cannot really do for now at the European Union. And that sometimes could prevent like some actors that we actually want to be on the ground from accessing those countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with that. Yeah, and switching gears a bit. So, as mentioned earlier, you've recently defended your doctoral thesis. So congratulations again on that. What's next for you? And how do you hope to contribute to the field moving forward?
So as you said, my doctoral thesis has been defended, and I'm now like hoping to really publish most of what's inside it. Ideally, I'm going to try to get a book out on the history of EU sanctions, and then a couple of articles. Some of them are already been published, some others like are on the way. So I think that's the kind of short-term answer, is that probably stay in academia, focus on getting everything out. And then for now, I think I'm quite happy to stay in academia, but I also realize that I'm lucky to work in a field of academia where there is kind of also private sector opportunities. And so I'll keep all my doors open, and I'm quite happy to know that there is like an exit road if I don't find like what I'm looking for like in the more academic world.
Thank you for sharing that, and I hope that you keep us in the loop of when things are getting published or moving forward, so we could also share it and read it to be on top of everything. And I guess to round out that question on your personal reflections, for students and young professionals that are interested in international relations, political science, sanctions policy, what advice would you give them based on your own journey?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what I did was like to find something I was really interested in. And I knew I could be interested in that for like many years, and then kind of try to focus on it and deep dive. And I think that's not always, I mean, when you do like a 4 or 5 years of PhD research on EU sanctions, there's a moment where you cannot really read or hear about it anymore. But I think it comes back. And that's because I started from a place of like really being interested by the topic. And so I often have like people asking me questions about like PhD topics and so on and so on. And I think the key is like to be really kind of like super interested in the base topic, and to try to find something that interests you one way or another, and then pursue it. So I think that's like the kind of the big advice I have. And on sanctions, I think sanctions are just a fascinating field right now to be in, because there is so much kind of like changes and so on and so on, including changes that might actually reduce a little bit the interest on sanctions. So we now see that like the second Trump administration is much more interested in tariffs and sanctions, at least sanctions like kind of narrowly defined, which create a big academic discussion about should tariffs be considered sanctions, but they have like political goals and so on and so on, which we're not going to open here. But I think, anyway, there is kind of like changing practices of all like states use like economic coercion. You have like countries like China and Russia that officially don't use sanctions. They have this position of being against the use of unilateral sanctions, but they clearly use some form of economic coercion. And I think that's also going to be a massive topic for the coming years.
Yeah, I agree. The tariffs thing, who knows what it's going to be labeled as, but that seems to be a new weapon now being used by the US. Also, what I was going to mention, it's, I lost my train of thought, but it's oh yeah, export controls and trade compliance. It used to always be kind of this compartmentalized thing away from sanctions, but because of the war in Ukraine, now it's merging with sanctions. And I think more and more sanctions compliance officers have to be upskilled to learn more on the export control and trade space, where in the past they just say, no, other people will deal with that. But now it's like, no, we have to be on top of that too. So yeah, I agree that tariffs will change the game a bit. We'll see how much. And we're already seeing some of the implications with export controls and then trade compliance. So yeah, I think it's more dynamic than ever. I keep trying to tell people that gone are the days are just list-based sanctions. We have to kind of be in the weeds more. We have to learn about different things, be on top of geopolitical issues. So it's definitely a dynamic place to be, and it's only increasing from what we've seen. You're almost off the hot seat, not just yet, but just a few more questions for you. Also, a bit more personal. If you could recommend one book or article to someone wanting to understand sanctions, what would it be?
So I think for one book, there is one that made a lot of noise a few years ago, which is called The Economic Weapon. It's a history book by Nicholas Mulder, and he really looks at the history of how modern sanctions came to be. And I think that's fascinating. It really focuses on the first part of the 20th century. And I think in my own work, I was inspired by that. And I tried to look at, okay, if we take the same type of questions and apply it to the European Union, like a bit later in the 20th century, like what do we find? But I think that's like a fascinating read. And he also gives you a little bit all the kind of the thinking about sanctions, like how intellectually this idea of using sanctions for foreign policy goals was constructed and so on,
Right.
so on. And so I think it's a fascinating read. And then there is one article that I really liked, which is called Viral Governance by Grégoire Mallard. And it's an academic article. It's quite heavy on social theory. So I think for people that are not trained in social science, might be a bit difficult. But it's really looking at this question of like, okay, what happened to sanctions once they're taken? And it's really look on US sanctions, but he basically makes the argument that like, sanctions are a bit of a weird like governmental tool because most of the implementation is actually done by private actors. It's the compliance department of companies, of banks, of financial institutions that do most of the work. And so that's kind of what he calls like viral governance. And I think it's a very, very interesting read. And it goes try to go like in depth about how kind of sanctions exist from the moment they are like adopted in the US by the government to the kind of the person being sanctioned. And I think that's a very interesting read as well.
Yeah, super interesting, how the shift from physical warfare to now this kind of hybrid way of looking at it with sanctions and tariffs and all this. So yeah, it's in my mind, because for me, money is the driver in most things. They do that because it's cheaper for them to implement sanctions and embargoes than it is to physically have an embargo or attack or fight another country. But yeah, I mean, like you said, a lot of it is not just the physical nature of it, but like you said, it's the ones that have to enforce it or implement it, or not even part of those governments. So that's another angle I never really considered. Yeah. And also, what are some common misconceptions about sanctions that you think should be debunked or that you would like to debunk?
So I think we already touched a bit on that. And then maybe it's less true now that it was like 5 years ago. But I think 5 years ago, there was this misconception that sanctions don't really matter, that they are like kind of like more like virtue signaling than anything else. And I think when you talk to people in sanctioned country, when you talk to humanitarian organizations and so on, they do matter. And it's not because that a government is not changing policy that they don't do anything. They do a lot of other things as well. So I think they should be taken seriously. And I think that's something that when people advocate in favor or even against sanctions, they should always keep in mind like these kind of real world impacts of sanctions and that are beyond just kind of like like political grandstanding or like virtue signaling.
Great point. And last question for you. If you were an academic, what career path do you think you would have pursued?
I think I almost became, you mentioned I studied at College of Europe, which is this institution in Belgium that is really tasked of like kind of forming the next generation of like EU like officers. So I think it would have been quite possible that I would have been ended up working in the European Union for an institution or another. I mean, my case, I think COVID really pushed me to go in towards academia. I was working outside of academia during COVID, and then I was at home, like many of us, and I just found that like my work became a bit less interesting and less like kind of I was less happy to kind of start working every morning. And then I realized, okay, maybe I should change what I do. And doing a PhD and going further in academia was always something I had in mind. But I think that was the moment I decided to take the leap.
And who knows, you might still follow that path. It's not too late. But yeah, very interesting to hear how you got there. So yeah, that's all the questions I had for you today, Jan. Thank you so much again for joining us and sharing about your past, about your some personal views. Super interesting to hear that. And like I said, please, once you have some more papers published, please let us know. We'll be happy to share it, and also, happy to continue the conversation with you as things progress in your career. And those of you who are watching, again, if you have any questions for Jan or for us at NFCP, please reach out. You can reach out to Jan directly via LinkedIn. You can reach out to NFCP either by emailing us at info@nfcp.org or on LinkedIn as well, where we share a lot of all of our content. So you will see this and other recordings published there as well. But yeah, any last parting words from you, Jan, before we let you go?
No, thank you very much for the invitation and all the best. I mean, I've started looking a little bit at the list of guests you had, and it was like very interesting conversations. So I think I encourage also people to listen to the other ones, and it was like fascinating discussions.
Awesome. Great. So everybody be well. Thanks again to Jan for joining with us, and have a great day wherever you are. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.